Okay, so I should have David on the screen. David, I can see you. So hello and welcome. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Been with you for now going on 8 hours, so it's been quite a pleasure.
The full run. You've been around the world, and you you started in Australia. We're almost back there.
Yep, we're returning home.
That's right. Well, David, thank you so much for coming on board, and obviously, as the keynote talk, we wanted to make sure that everyone understood this is quite an important topic that you've had brewing here for a while, and that I know you've spent a lot of time researching and trying to deliberate between, and it's a very interesting point of view, both for threat intelligence, both for incident response, and everything in between. So we're really looking forward to it. And for those who don't know, David is the founder and CEO of URSA Inc. So we're really pleased to have him on board on the topic of UAV threats to the oil and gas industry. So David, I'm going to start disappearing off the screen now, and your presentation should be up and you can take it away. So thanks so much. You've got the last talk of the event, and thanks for sticking with us.
Thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. I should have the full display up. I'm only running with one monitor, so hopefully I've got everybody here. Thank everybody who's been here all day and whoever has joined us. I'm speaking on what UAVs may pose as a threat to oil and gas and the energy industry in general. But a lot of what I'm going to cover here really touches on things that you've been hearing all day. To set the sort of stage, as was said, my name is David Kovar, CEO and founder of URSA Incorporated. I had a lot of help from a gentleman named Tim Wright on this. He's a very well-established aerospace journalist, and he has the ability, due to his experience, to dig into places where I don't. So it was a really good collaboration. This collaboration also resulted in some interesting stories to tell, maybe over a drink sometime. But different agencies respond better to somebody who is a journalist, and other ones respond better to somebody who's not a journalist. So we didn't always get that right. It's been an interesting journey in that regard. Let me do the too long didn't read story here. The threat is real. You've been hearing that from various people throughout the day. Many organizations are underestimating or downplaying the threat. That's not something that we've been hearing quite as much, but I'll give you some data to support that particular conclusion. The Counter-UAS community is part of the problem as well as part of the solution. This is a difficult thing to say. I am part of that community. But I think that if we all sort of step back and look at what we're doing and how we're doing it, there is a certain kernel of truth to this particular statement. And this is a great opportunity. This particular group, DroneSec, other forms or other forums for collaboration are opportunities for us to have discussions about how we can move what we're doing to be more firmly in the we're part of the solution part of that continuum. My conclusion, my belief, and I think you've been hearing it from other people today, is that threat intelligence is important. We need to understand the threat. We need to understand the nature of the actors behind that threat. We need to understand what we're trying to defend against so we can align what our defenses are with the threat. And sharing is and always will be a significant contributor to managing the risks associated with malicious SUAS. That sharing is crucial. This forum is a great opportunity for it. DroneSec has a platform, and I'll talk about some other ones later in this presentation as well. But right now, a lot of really important information is stovepiped or siloed in various places. Some of that's behind national security concerns. Some of it's in competitive, I don't want to share with my competitors. Some of it's tied up in intellectual property. Some of it's just tied up in non-disclosure agreements. Some of it's just tied up in we don't know whether we can share this stuff or not. But I believe that we're not doing the national security any service by sort of keeping all that information about what is or is not going on to ourselves. And that's not just a US problem. That's a national problem for anybody anywhere in the world. To start off, to frame the overall conversation, this is from Sandia National Labs, a paper that they wrote back in 2007. And it applies to kinetic and cyber attacks. And by the way, I've got 20 years of doing cybersecurity, about 5 years of doing incident response, digital forensics, a bunch of things like that. So I come from more of the cyber community, but I've got some kinetic experience in security as well. So their statement is that to build the right defense, and the right defense means the ones that are most effective. It also means that it's cost effective. There are a lot of definitions to what the right defense is. But to build the defenses capable of withstanding or surviving cyber, kinetic attack, or a drone attack, we must understand the capabilities posed by those threats to the government, to the function, or to the system. We've got to understand who the threat actors are, what they're using to create that threat, and only then can we really start building the right defenses. This particular conversation is about energy infrastructure. You could be protecting pretty much anything, but I'm using this particular one. I live in New Hampshire, so you're upper right on this one. This is just all the power plants in the United States. There's an awful lot of them. And there's a surprising number of nuclear reactors in here, including one that's 20 minutes away from my house, which I oftentimes forget. There are an enormous number of oil and gas refining and processing facilities scattered around the country. You'll notice there's a lot of the Midwest. I used to drive between Washington, D.C. and New Hampshire all the time, and so I'd see the ones in New Jersey. There's a bunch down in Southern California. There's a lot of it down around the Gulf Coast, and we'll get to that in a minute. There's a lot of natural gas pipelines. Thankfully, a lot of these are buried, but not all. There's also oil pipelines and other transmission systems on the surface that are potentially vulnerable. Crude oil, petroleum, HEC. What's left out of these graphics is high transmission lines, which are getting a lot more attention. After the fire in Northern California last year that was caused by poorly inspected high transmission lines, those are becoming much more of an area of concern. So if the energy infrastructure is the thing that we believe is at risk, what is creating that risk in the context of this conversation? We've been talking about UAVs, and so let's get down into some specifics. Any sub $2,000 drone, and I'd even say any sub $1,000 drone, can pose a risk for energy infrastructure. They can be used for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. All you gotta do is get up there and take pictures with it. They can be used as a distraction. Right now, a drone flying over any sensitive facility is gonna get some attention. And so you can use a $200, $500, FPV racer, whatever it is you want, to draw the attention of the security forces away from something else that you're doing, or just to see how they're going to react. And similar to distraction, you can use it for confusion. You can use it to create the perception that something's occurring that's not occurring. Getting down to specifics, DJI Mavics. DJI has somewhere between 75 and 85% of the consumer commercial market, so very popular platforms. And they've been really popular with hacking community, people that want to modify these things to get around the no-fly zones and to do other things that they were not originally designed to do. In the context of posing threat, some of the things that are getting done with these are making them fly much longer ranges than they're intended. And so there used to be these hacked battery attachments, so you can now have two batteries attached. Now people are using 3D printers to make a more professional ability to add a battery to these platforms. A couple of years ago, somebody put a Raspberry Pi with a cellular modem on one and used that for flying longer ranges. Now you can do that with off-the-shelf stuff for non-DJI products. And we've seen coming out of Mexico and presumably other places that they're being used for delivering malicious payloads, excuse me. There's a photograph of C4, 1 pound of C4 attached to a DJI Mavic. I think that most of us understand that the motivated threat actors are going to be moving away from commercial off-the-shelf products and moving towards home built. There are a variety of solutions or reasons for this. On the DJI front, Aeroscope is becoming somewhat prevalent, and if you're going to fly a DJI product, there's a good chance that you're going to be picked up by an Aeroscope. So easy way to avoid that problem, fly something else. There's some concerns about serial numbers. If you use it for malicious purposes and it's captured, serial numbers on the UAV could be used for tracing the person who purchased it back and then showing up at their house. So Homebuilts, there has some really good capabilities that come along with using them. You can make it fully anonymous using Pixhawk or some other flight controller. You can make it shut off the RF link. So now any counter-UAS system that's dependent on the RF link is going to be blind to them. It can fly an autonomous flight. It can do certain steps during that flight, take pictures, draw payloads, things like that. And then it can turn that RF link back on if necessary at certain points during its flight. It's much easier to use a custom data link. There's a variety of counter-UAS systems out there that are looking for specific, what I would call fingerprints, specific types of communication on specific frequencies. If somebody uses a cellular modem, obviously you're moving your data link from 915 megahertz well up into the spectrum. But there's plenty of other parts of the spectrum that you could use where somebody wouldn't see it on the RF. So that's certainly an option that comes along with Homebuilt. Also, you can control what your radar cross-section looks like. If you're using an EPO foam fixed wing, your biggest radar reflector is going to be the battery. So that gives you control over that. More on the commercial side, where there are some really powerful platforms out there, and we've seen some of them earlier today. The Avarotech Boxer Hybrid. This is a gas-electric hybrid, commercially available, has a 5-kilogram payload and a 2-hour flight time. There's a lot you can do with that at a long range. Firefly 6 is made here in New Hampshire. DOI was flying it for wildfire purposes before that fleet was grounded. EPO foam VTOL, 50 minutes endurance, 1.5-pound payload, $8,000 ready to go. It's also got a really nice sensor that you can say, watch this particular location, and no matter what you're doing with the aircraft, the focus of the EO/IR sensor will be on that location. So really powerful platform, and again, for $8,000, pretty much any motivated attacker could go acquire one. I mentioned the Syrian Homebuilts. I get tired of people saying what you're proposing isn't possible. Syrian home-built attack on the Russian air base, and I think this is 2018. Balsa plywood, gas engine. They supposedly flew about 50 kilometers. There were no GPS units on them, as far as I could tell. So these things were flying fully autonomously. If there were GPS units on there were certainly no radio links, and so they were not being manually flown from launch all the way to their target. So if this could be done in 2018 in Syria, what can be done in 2020 in the United States? I mentioned jet turbine fixed wings in here. I think they were mentioned in an earlier presentation as well. These things are amazing. Very high speed. There was some components of a jet turbine found in an ISIS drone factory a couple of years ago. Nothing functional, but you could tell that threat actors were starting to think about this particular platform. If you've got a jet turbine fixed wing coming at you, by the time that your counter-UAS system detects it and makes some sort of decision, even if it's automated in terms of how it's going to respond to that incursion, it is most likely going to be on target. So the speed is one really interesting characteristic of it. Another characteristic of it is that the explosive payload is the fuel that it is using already. At that speed, if it impacts a solid surface, that fuel is going to aerosolize, and then the motor, the impact, is going to detonate that fuel. How big is that explosion? It all depends. Raspberry Pi plus OpenCV plus ISR. So ISR is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance again. OpenCV is an open source image recognition platform, and we know what Raspberry Pis are. The combination of these three things gives you the opportunity to do all route and terminal guidance without a GPS, just using optical recognition. And the reason I mentioned ISR is not just because of that all route, but if you think about what a petroleum refinery looks like at night, it's got this beautiful color spectrum and all these lights on it and things like that. And I suspect you would find that those are a very unique fingerprint. You can, given a certain pattern of light, say, oh, I'm coming in from this angle and I'm this far away. So that's where you get your terminal guidance. And then one of the other things that's creating risk and opportunity is software-defined radio. We're using it on the Counter-UAS side, but malicious actors are going to use it as well. It gives them the opportunity to change their data links, to encrypt them. It also gives them the opportunity to use SDR for gathering intelligence about a site. And I'll get to that in a little bit as well. We're familiar with the Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, Group 4, Group 5 classification for UAVs. US DoD uses this, NATO uses it as well, some others. It's a good way of thinking about capabilities in terms of size, weight, payload, endurance, and altitude. But as we're trying to really figure out what's creating or posing a threat to us or to the sites we're trying to protect, I really suggest that you think about a sort of broader range of capabilities. This comes from a NASA paper, I think was done back in 2010 and it had nothing to do with Counter-UAS. It was really just thinking about what sort of capabilities there are for UAVs. Some of the interesting ones are here, all weather conditions. So, you know, if you are at a base in the Arctic and you're concerned about UAVs, yeah, you're going to need to have something coming at you is going to need to be all weather capable. One of the interesting things in here, particularly given swarm technologies, is the monitoring control multi-ship operation, mother-daughter ship operations. So it just gives some examples of some things to think about in terms of capabilities that might be brought to bear on you, on your system, on your facility. So we've talked about what's at risk, about what creates a risk. Here are the things that those UAVs pose as risks. We talked about ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. A lot of people, when I've talked to them about, you know, why somebody might use their drones around security site, and they say, hey, all this imagery is in Google Earth. You know, I can just go do it. Well, first of all, Google Earth, the images are taken when they're taken. You have no control over it. Second of all those images are straight down or as close to it as they can get. That doesn't give you some really valuable information in terms of what the physical layout is, looking at it from all angles. It doesn't give you examples of what the lighting changes when it's sunset or sunrise. It doesn't give you information about how people are moving around the facility and things like that. So yeah, Google Earth is wonderful for doing remote surveillance and reconnaissance, but at some point in time in your desire to go effect upon this facility, you're going to want to get eyes on, and drones provide a really good eyes on capability. They can also fly some sensors other than optical. LiDAR can be used if you really want to get into looking at how the facility is constructed down to a very, very fine level of detail. And if you're trying to put a precision strike with a small explosive payload on, then having that sort of knowledge could be very helpful. IR gives you information about where heat sources are, obviously. That could be people movement. It could be where generators are. It could be where cooling ponds are, all sorts of things. RF collection. This is something that doesn't come up too often, but it's why I mentioned SDR earlier. If you are trying to attack a facility or attack a site, you really want to understand what's going on with the defense. What are they capable of? What's their operational tempo like? What are they doing? And so RF collection is one of the things that you would want to do, SIGINT. So what frequencies are they using? What are they using those frequencies for? And can you capture and collect some of that comms traffic? You may, by capturing that traffic, find out what their shift changes are if you're not getting it via other means. You may use this for deciding what to jam when you decide you're actually going to take action upon the site, things like that. There are passive risks created. We talked about distraction and intimidation. Response analysis, and I'll talk about the Palo Verde site in a little bit, but these drones were over the site for 2 days running. So the first day drones were over it, you get one sense of what the response looks like. You come by a second time or later, it's like, have they changed their response? And understanding how the defender is going to react to the various moves you're going to make is a really important part of preparing yourself and your team for the action you're about to take. And then there's obviously payload delivery. So some examples, most of these are familiar. We spent a lot of time digging into this, and then we realized that there are more examples than are really necessary. I mentioned Palo Verde. If you've been following the drive, they've been doing some interesting articles on Palo Verde and some other issues, and that's where a lot of our information comes from. To summarize, Palo Verde is the largest nuclear reactor in the United States. It's in Arizona. On September 29th and 30th of 2019, 5 or 6 UAVs, 2 feet in diameter, were on site for 80 minutes. They were hanging out, they were looking around for 80 minutes, and nothing could be done about them. The NRC ILT Lab, their Intelligence and Liaison Threat Assessment Branch, and the FOIA recovered documents told the site operators and the NRC in general, please stop calling us during off hours. Some people took this to mean some things that are sort of not favorable of this particular group. They're not a response organization. I think it was a fairly reasonable response on their part. Hey, there's nothing we can do at 2 o'clock in the morning. Let us sleep so we can do our job when we get up in the morning. But the take home here is that they were probably being called because no one knew who else to call to say, hey, we got drones over our facility. What are we supposed to do about it? The NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, does not require Counter-UAS at nuclear plants, asserting that small drones could not damage reactors. A small drone might not be able to damage the actual reactor itself. If you look at the picture on the right, there's a lot of other infrastructure around that reactor that makes it function that is potentially at risk. And even if there was no damage that caused the reactor to be shut down, simply the knowledge that a US nuclear reactor, nuclear power plant, was attacked by some sort of explosive carried by a drone is going to have a financial impact and a terrorist type of impact as well. At this particular site, there was previous UAV overflights on December 21st of 2017, and to an earlier point, there was another overflight on December 2019, and there may have been a counter-UAS system deployed on the site at that time. So somebody may have come back, they figured, okay, we're coming back, 2-3 months later, has anything changed, to find out whether it did or did not. As part of, they got the information about Palo Verde, there's a reporting system. It turns out that there are 57 UAV incidents over US nuclear sites from December 2014 through October 2019. 3 are still open. 5 are closed, resolved. Presumably, hey, we know what was going on. 49 cases are closed, unresolved. They do not know who was operating over the site. They don't know what was going on. 3 were at Palo Verde, 5 were at Limerick in Pennsylvania, 6 were at Perry, and 7 of them were at Diablo Canyon in California. That's a lot of UAV overflights. Eastern Colorado, most of us are familiar with this. In late 2019, there was a lot of observations of UAVs over Eastern Colorado. I'll get through this as quickly as I can. According to the FAA, multiple highly credible official reports from trained observers. So people who supposedly understand what they're looking at or not looking at, and who are not going to confuse a satellite, for example, with a UAV. These trained observers articulate that there was a unique arrangement in which a large drone seems to have been accompanied by a fleet of smaller ones. The number of UAVs ranged from 2 to 16, approximately 6 feet in width, so sizable aircraft, flight time between 2 and 3 hours, nighttime operations, flying grid-like patterns. That's a significant operation. So who was doing it? Military, commercial? The answer, according to the FAA, it was neither military nor commercial. All the military commands that they asked said, nope, was not us. And they went through, I presume, all of the open waivers. They reached out to all the commercial operators in the region, said, hey, was this you? And according to the FAA, it was not commercial or military. So we still don't know. But another take home here is that, and I'll get to this in more detail, is that if you're a malicious actor, there's a lot of sort of noise going on in the environment that you might be able to hide within. And that gets to the what is normal. If you're not keeping up with the sort of evolution of the counter-UAS and the UAS industry in the United States, it's been quietly, excuse the language, taking off. People are getting beyond visual line of sight waivers. People are now effectively, and have been for months, using UAVs for inspecting pipelines, the dirty, dull, and dangerous, as well as tracks and all sorts of other things. The literature on the left side of the screen is from a vendor that sells UAVs into this space. They assert that some of these operations are better done at night. And so there's an excuse for having UAVs over critical infrastructure at night. The VTOL UAV that they provide can fly up to 40 kilometers beyond visual line of sight, and flight endurance of 88 minutes. Pretty powerful aircraft, and it operates in a variety of weather conditions. On the right, there's a quote that says, more often than not, operators hire contractors, and subcontractors often hire their own subcontractors. If you're trying to figure out who's actually flying over a site, and you got to work through all those legal layers of contracts, good luck getting that done in a timely manner. And it may be difficult to do even if you've got more time. Elsewhere, Louisiana, 3 Spanish male. So on the graphic I showed you about where energy infrastructure is, I mentioned there's a density down around Louisiana. Mississippi River drains out there. There's a lot of energy infrastructure in the Gulf itself. A lot of shipping coming in there. There's a lot of energy infrastructure down there, including some apparently very rare chemicals coming out of it. After the area was devastated by a hurricane, there was a lot of pressure to get certain refineries back up online as quickly as possible, because some of the chemicals coming out of that region are apparently incredibly important to national security, and that was the only source of it. So looking at what's going on in Louisiana makes a lot of sense if you're trying to get a sense of what's at risk and what's creating that risk. 3 Spanish males were arrested for flying UAV over Valero back in 2018. The second quote is a detective who, while they were on site at a Dow chemical facility, observed a small UAV that was remaining stationary and rotating 360. So not just flying through, not fly away, something was sitting there intentionally and doing what we would consider a surveillance sort of activity. One of the guys working on a different site had a UAV crash right in front of his truck. Could be flyaway. Incident reports don't get beyond the fact that this happened. France, 2014, overflights of 7 nuclear reactors. 2018, Greenpeace flew a drone dressed up like Superman into a nuclear reactor. So demonstrating, hey, there's a security problem here. In the United States, there was a Mavic found next to a non-bulk electric substation with some ropes, and then at the end of the ropes was copper wire. Presumably could have been used for shorting out transformers and things like that. I've been asking for the picture of this. I've been told by multiple credible sources it exists. No one's shared the picture of that with me. If you have a copy of it, feel free to send it to me anonymously or take credit for it one way or another. I'd love to see that one. We talked about Saudi Arabia, previous presentations. You can go look this up. It was the most significant attack on energy infrastructure to date, and I think it's reasonable to assume that it's not going to be the last. So what's at risk? What's creating the risk? What are the risks? What's going on in the United States? We wanted to sort of categorize, how big is the problem based and what are they doing? On the upper right, and this is something that the hobbyists, get all bent out of shape about for good reason. most people are compliant. The vast majority of people flying in the United States, we believe, are compliant. They're staying below the thresholds, they're flying in approved locations, they're getting the right waivers, they're registering and things like that. So let's just, and unfortunately there's not sufficient amount of data to prove any of this, but these are all reasonable assumptions, I think. So vast majority of these people are compliant. Below that, there's a smaller number of people who are just careless. They kind of know what's going on, but they're not paying attention. They go too high, they fly over somebody's property. These people are still not a real big threat. It's just, they're gonna create attention, and that's not good for any of us, particularly the people who are being compliant. There's the clueless. These people haven't registered with the FAA. They don't know that there are regulations in place, and they're just gonna do whatever they want. The risk that the threat they're creating is still relatively small. They're not flying with malicious intent. They're just being stupid. Now we're getting down to the people who create some amount of risk. These are the thrill seekers who are continuously pushing the boundaries, intentionally flying into restricted airspace. They don't mean harm, but they don't understand that the harm that they're doing, they can potentially do by what they're doing, but also the harm they're doing to the entire industry. There are videos of people flying Mavics above the clouds. And the cloud deck at that location was 8,000 feet plus. So they are well out of visual line of sight, and it's a beautiful picture, and they keep doing this and they keep pushing the envelope. This sort of activity we need to clamp down on, unfortunately, and fortunately. But they're still not the people that are going to pose a threat to the energy infrastructure. Now we're talking criminal and terrorists. These are the smallest number of actual operations, but they are posing the greatest threat. You can produce your own threat matrix, and I encourage you to do so if you're responsible for protecting a facility. One other take home from this threat matrix is, again, the getting lost in the noise. The terrorists and the criminals are going to be the very small number of overall flights, and if those terrorists and criminals can look like a legitimate flight or just somebody who's clueless or careless, that gives them additional cover that they can use for accomplishing their particular goals. What are our challenges? Our being the energy infrastructure, energy community, the Counter-UAS community, the people who are doing UAV forensics research. What are our challenges? What is it that we need to step up, take care of, so that we can be better contributors to national security, to site security, to all of these things that protecting society against malicious UAVs? Senator Cory Gardner, Colorado, January 8, 2020, after the whole Colorado drone problem, publicly stood up and said something that is one of the most important things in this presentation. There's a significant gap in the understanding, and our understanding, personal understanding, and the national security's understanding of the threat that drones pose to the United States. If we don't understand the threat that these drones pose to us, we cannot even have a rational discussion about how to defend against them, much less actually build those defenses. So problem one is understanding the threat. Problem two is downplaying the threat. Kelsey Atherton, I follow on Twitter. I read his articles. He does some great stuff. He understands military, he understands regulatory, he understands politics. Really good writer. I admire the heck out of him. However, in a Forbes article that had to do with nuclear reactor site security vis-a-vis drones, he concluded that there is no risk posed by small drones until they get the ability to carry larger, heavier payloads without losing much flight time. And until those happen, only then should we rethink our infrastructure hardening. I will stand up here or sit here and raise my hand and say, those things are already possible. And earlier in this presentation and other presentations, we demonstrated that. If Saudi Aramco was probably a nation state actor, okay, so maybe not that, but the attack on the Russian airbase was certainly something that demonstrates that you can get heavy payloads over long distances, and that was in 2018. So it's beyond time for rethinking infrastructure hardening. And this sort of thinking, I feel, is downplaying the issue and not focusing time, attention, and resources on where the problems are. Joseph Rivers, this came out of the FOIA release from the Palo Verde incident. He makes two really good points here. Putting regulations in place is not going to stop the motivated actor. So restricted airspace is not going to stop anything. He asserts that detection systems, counter-UAS systems, have limited success rates. I would generally agree with him, unfortunately. And there's a low likelihood that law enforcement will arrive quickly enough to go find the operators. His take, I agree, we should focus our attention on getting federal regulations and laws changed to allow sites to defend themselves and get the resources required to identify engineering fixes that would mitigate the adversarial attack. So if a UAV does get in, how do we mitigate against that? Jacob's presentation just prior to mine is spot on this, and that is an incredibly important part of the conversation. And we should not walk away from today's wonderful presentations thinking that it's only technical solutions. There's legal solutions, there's information sharing solutions, there's a lot of other things that need to be done in addition to technical solutions. Remote ID and UTM. There's a belief that remote ID, UTM are going to solve a lot of this problem. We just need to wait. Well, first of all, they're probably 3 years out. Second of all, and most of this comes from my cybersecurity background, these are likely to be federated solutions put together by commercial vendors who must make a profit, who are then working with government entities who may be under-resourced, and they are all working together to collaborate to build these systems. And those systems must have perfect cybersecurity, or they are going to be part of the problem. Some of the problems are, there's going to be a legitimate backdoor. We have seen this in other circumstances. We've seen the FBI asking or demanding that Apple create backdoors in their system. There's not going to be a remote ID system and a UTM system that does not have legitimate backdoors in it for use for national security reasons. If they're legitimate backdoors, there's a good chance those backdoors will get compromised and used for non-legitimate purposes, and then there's the pure exploits. So it's going to be a complex cybersecurity system. There are going to be problems with it. People will exploit that. They will find ways of manipulating remote ID and UTM for their own purposes. There's also a lot of quote valid, unquote reasons not to disclose where drones are operating and why. Amazon's not going to want anybody other than Amazon to have really detailed knowledge of where all their UAVs are going, how much payload they were carrying, what their flight times were. This is all business intellectual property. It's competitive intelligence. And then there's, national security flights. There's going to be law enforcement flights. There's going to be all these carve-outs where people are going to have some sort of reason to say, hey, wait, I should not be squawking some sort of remote ID, and I should not be participating in the UTM system. We're going to have to work through that, and I'll point back to Jacob and say, hey, look, this is going to fall in your court because it's going to be a legal issue and a regulatory issue. Malicious operators will hide in the gaps in the noise. The gaps may exist simply because of flaws in the system. They may create those gaps themselves through the exploits. I love the FAA. I'm a manned pilot. Through the nature of how the national airspace has been managed over the decades, it's a remarkably safe space to operate, and they are coming at unmanned vehicles from that same perspective of we're looking for zero fault airspace. Unfortunately, they got a really poor track record of enforcing any sort of compliance. And if somebody's not complying with remote ID or not complying with UTM, what are the consequences for not complying? We're going to have to work our way through that. Hobbyists, open source activists, foreign tech imports will likely create a non-compliant noise floor to hide in as well. If you are trying to attack or surveil some facility and there's a bunch of hobbyists flying in the area who are intentionally non-compliant, that creates a noise floor for you to operate in. Or you could have some of your, quote, friends go be non-compliant hobbyists while you are tangentially working with them and flying inside their noise envelope. Other people have mentioned this, and I'm glad they did, because I find it incredibly frustrating. There's an enormous number of counter-UAS vendors out there. In 2018, there was 230 of them. I'm sure it's increased by now. I've worked in the counter-UAS test and evaluation space and still am. So I've been talking to people in the DoD and the government about, on the procurement side, they don't know what works and what doesn't. And this is where I think we as an industry need to get our act together. If you are a site operator and you want to know what counter-UAS systems works best in your environment, close to an urban area, hot and humid because you're down in Louisiana, no good lines of sight because there are refineries next door to you, which counter-UAS systems have been deployed in a similar environment, and what sorts of flight profiles, what sort of threat profiles were flown against those systems? And when were those tests done? That we need to have standardized testing of counter-UAS systems in multiple types of environments, that we can do repeatability, we can do compare and contrast. Otherwise, as this counter-UAS researcher put it, we have no source of truth. Somehow, we've got to go solve that problem. So take-homes from that one are, we really don't know what systems do or do not work. And if they work in one environment, we don't know whether they work as well in another environment, and we don't know what threats they work against or don't work against. For example, if somebody changes the RF link, are they going to work against that? Just an example. Threat information is siloed. I'll talk about how we might be able to solve that towards the end of this presentation. But all of us need to be thinking about how do we help inform other people in the space of protecting this infrastructure to do a better job of it. And the last one bothers me across the board. I see requests for proposals for counter-UAS systems or things like that that are addressing last year's problems. What was ISIS using in 2018? Or what is the cartel using in Mexico in 2020? Drone swarms exist. Autonomous drone swarms exist. Jet turbine UAVs exist. All of these things are possible, and we as a community, and in collaboration with the governments that we're working with, and in collaboration with the people that we are trying to defend, need to start thinking actively and talking about it, not just thinking about it, but talking about it and saying, okay, what's coming down the pike, and how do we, if not get ahead of that, how do we catch up with it? So what can we do? CISA is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. As a U.S. entity. I was somehow unaware of them before I started down this process. They are focused on cybersecurity infrastructure. They've got a very broad mandate, and I was looking around for federal governments, agencies that understood that there's a counter-UAS threat, and we're doing something about it. Enter CISA. Everything you see here comes from their website. They've got a lot of really good materials in terms of how to talk about it. They've got one-pagers, they've got placards, they've got all sorts of materials for educating different types of people about the nature of the threat and what actions can you take about it. If you are in the energy industry and you're not hooked into CISA, I strongly encourage you that you do so. They've got representatives scattered throughout the country, and they're very happy to talk about this sort of stuff. They articulate things I've been saying in this presentation. The UAS-related threats may include weaponized or smuggling payloads. They may include prohibited surveillance and reconnaissance. They may include intellectual property theft, and they may include intentional disruption or harassment. This is a U.S. government agency saying this thing. This is worth paying attention to. What actions can you take? As Jacob and others have said during this presentation, we're somewhat hampered in the United States. So their first bullet point is research and implement legally approved counter-UAS technology. They also then get into things that don't require buying a counter-UAS system. And I apologize to the counter-UAS vendors out there, but there's a lot of things you can do without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on counter-UAS systems to help protect your facility. And I'll get into some of them here and on the next slide as well. Know the air domain around the facility and who has authority to take action to enhance the security. If you're in with a bunch of other energy facilities, build a community whereby you're getting advance notice, you're doing information sharing within your own community. Contact the FAA can consider UAS restrictions. We're all working on that. Update your emergency incident action plans. This is worth doing, if only so people know what to look for, what data to gather. And this goes to Chris Church's presentation way at the early part of the day. Figure out how to gather information about these incidents in a methodical fashion and report it in a consistent fashion so we can start understanding the problem. Build federal, state, and local partnerships, and report the potential UAS threats to your local law enforcement agency. This is a great slide. If you take nothing else from my slide, my presentation, I would suggest taking this one. This is an example of some of those CISA recommendations in action. I was doing a presentation at B-Sides New Orleans 2 years ago now. I met this gentleman. His contact information is in the appendix. There's another slide down there. This is an example of collaboration between the Coast Guard, InfraGard, and for those not in the United States, the InfraGard is a FBI initiative for sharing information between the private sector and the FBI. And so it's a collaboration between the Coast Guard, the FBI, and a lot of the energy infrastructure operators in the New Orleans area, particularly Port of New Orleans. They've established this relationship back in 2016, and one of the things they've done is they've got a mandatory requirement for saying, hey, I'm going to be flying a UAV in the area. So if you see a UAV over your facility, you can call somebody in and say, hey, I'm seeing a UAV. They look at their list and say, nope, it shouldn't be there. Now you know you got some sort of threat, or now you don't. You can now make a much quicker decision. It's not automated at the moment. Well, it may be, but it doesn't have to be automated. It could be as simple as a phone call and somebody looking at an Excel spreadsheet or pulling up a piece of paper. It's simple to get started on this stuff. It costs you very little. It builds relationships, and it starts giving you a situational awareness of what is and is not going on in your airspace or the airspace that you're sharing. They did automate a fair bit of this, and how much of it I do not know. Reach out to them. But they are bringing in a lot of information and making it available to all the people participating in this, such as safety exercises and training and things like that. I'm just making sure I'm not out of time. I'm good. This is a part of a larger deck from a gentleman. His contact information is later on in it. He was doing red teaming and found that essentially doing red teaming was frustrating. It really wasn't a challenge. What he stepped back and did is start doing adversary modeling, so threat modeling. And this is one example of one of his tools where he looks at essentially a very compact kill chain. And for those not familiar with it, the kill chain is basically the steps that an adversary must take to go from start to actually having an effect on the target. In the cybersecurity world, it was exfilling the data out of our environment. In this circumstances, it's actually gathering the intelligence or delivering the payload. The take home from a kill chain is that if you can stop the kill chain at any point before they finish their mission, you have succeeded to some degree. So this is sort of a very compact UAV kill chain for a threat actor. And he goes through a bunch of the steps that they would have to get through to accomplish their mission. And each one of these steps is an opportunity for you to deny them the ability to accomplish that step and to deny them their overall mission. So he's got a bunch of tools for helping you do this sort of stuff. One of the easiest ones is helping site operators figure out where somebody might launch a UAV from. Why is this interesting? Well, you could just put a game camera out there and have it out there and check it once a day or do it wirelessly and see if there's somebody launching UAVs from any of these locations that this model demonstrates. If they are, go talk to them and say, why are you flying UAVs over my property? You've now, with essentially a little bit of consulting work and a game camera or a little bit higher end security camera, started implementing Counter-UAS without having to worry about hacking into a data link or anything like that. So very much worth considering. This gentleman's great. There are other people out there. You can do it yourself. Very much worth considering. If you're in the United States and familiar with AISACs, they are basically a private sector vertical information collaboration for sharing cybersecurity vulnerabilities and responses to it. The FS ISAC is the one I was most involved in, Financial Services ISAC. There are a bunch of others. I proposed an AV ISAC for everybody who had anything to do with autonomous vehicles to join this organization and share information within a well-orchestrated lockdown environment. This is membership driven. There's a bunch of issues with it. I never got it off the ground. I think I was a little bit too early. Maybe it's time to revisit it. If you're interested in it, come let me know. This one is a solution that when I was doing cybersecurity was incredibly impactful. It requires trust. It requires a bunch of people to say, and a bunch of people and their organization to say, yeah, we understand why the needs of the many outweigh essentially our own competitive advantage. What was going on is that we had a very secure mechanism for sharing TTPs, tactics, tools, and procedures, as well as malware signatures and things like that. And there were people from opposing firms, consulting firms, from security vendors, from malware vendors, malware protection vendors, all that sort of stuff. People that had an honest, competitive interest in not collaborating with each other. But they all came together because they understood that within the right model, within the right information sharing model, that they could still further their own company's interests and possibly even benefit their company's interests by getting this information from other companies, and also help protect national security. The reason I think this is important, and the reason I think that threat intelligence sharing and development is important, is this list of bullet points. So I've said this other slide is most important. This is another one. We're engaged in a futuristic war. Things I read as science fiction even 3 years ago are now in the present. We've got to bring everything we can to bear to get caught up and get ahead of the threat actors. If we don't do that, we're going to be under-resourced and behind the curve, and it's going to get very frustrating, which is one of the reasons I exited the cybersecurity space. We're also often asked to fight last year's battles, which I also find particularly frustrating. We need to be thinking ahead so that we have the right solutions in place when the threat actors catch up to us, rather than vice versa. Our adversaries are similar to the cybersecurity adversaries. They range from activists to criminals to non-state actors to nation-state actors, which means that their motivations and their capabilities and their ability to show up in the country are wide-ranging. If it's just one of these groups, it'd be much easier. There's no just one potential threat organization. We have limited resources. The federal government has even more limited resources. And with COVID sucking up a lot of budgets, and increasing the national deficit and things like that, those resources may even be further challenged. We in the United States are hampered by a very challenging regulatory environment. Jacob and others have talked to that. It really hamstrings our ability to respond. So we need to think creatively, and we need to think collaboratively. If we are working with limited intelligence, it is often due to our own inability or unwillingness to collaborate. We need to find ways of collaborating. My proposal, the organization I was referring to for the cybersecurity stuff, operated with 2 rules. One was the Chatham House rule. And by the way, it's Chatham House rule. There's only one rule. Participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speakers nor that of any other participant may be revealed. So don't out anybody. Don't out their organization. It compromises this whole entire effort. And then the other fundamental tool was the traffic light protocol. If something's tagged TLP red, you are not to disclose it. It's restricted to people in the conversation only. Amber, limited disclosure, restricted to participants' organizations. So you can take it back to your organization, but they cannot then go use it for public speaking or press releases. TLP green, restricted to the community. TLP white. So this is a framework, it's a potential for how to create this sort of trusted sharing community among people who might otherwise not be able to collaborate. In the appendix to this presentation, there's a lot more details on it. You can just reach out to me as well. Another option is the organization that's supporting this presentation. They are in the threat intelligence business. They have tools for doing this. There are a lot of opportunities for us to support each other and support the community. And I'm deeply thankful to Mike for giving us all this opportunity. And I'm really deeply thankful to all the other presenters for adding context and color to the whole thing. And finally, I'm very thankful to everybody who's taken the time today to listen to me and the other speakers. Without you, we wouldn't know what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And I really encourage everybody who's been in this conversation today to continue joining the conversation. Reach out publicly, reach out privately, join one of the organizations or mechanisms for sharing information. Tell us what your problems are, and really help us help you. So with that, my presentation's over, and I will see if I can get back to normal.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, David. That was just terrific presentation, and I I kind of stopped writing down quotes there at the end because you just had so many, but a few really stood out to me that I just want to repeat. You know, the one was that you're saying we're kind of doing a national security disservice by not sharing some of that information. And the other kind of thing that you said right at the end, which matched something you said at the start, was, you know, we're fighting last year's battles, we're selling solutions for last year's challenges, and it does kind of feel that way. And I think with your experience in cybersecurity, you probably feel like with drones, we do have the ability to restart on a better note. You know, cybersecurity really was a bit of a haywire, and we're still trying to play catch up. And so we're still early days. I still believe that, you know, we're still early days, and there might be, you know, ways to get around that and better prepare for the next few years. So just absolutely, you know, mind-boggling there. And I just want to quickly discuss the working group you were talking about a little bit there. You mentioned the AV ISAC, but was that what you had in mind in terms of the, you know, drone sharing, information sharing that you linked towards the end as a new type of working group? Or is that something you want to reboot the AV ISAC? Maybe just a bit more information on that would be good.
Yeah, thank you very much. There are multiple ways of going about sharing information. The AV ISAC is the above the board, loud and proud mechanism for doing that. It does have full-time people running the organization to catalog and organize the information. It's got a director who's out there bringing in new people to participate in it. So there's membership fees for it. And, you know, for some of the existing ISACs, that's $25,000 a year for the larger organizations. So it is a very good mechanism. It's a very well-established in the United States mechanism for doing this sort of thing. The other solution is sort of the other end of the spectrum. It's very on the quiet. It's almost like Fight Club. You don't say that you're part of this particular organization. We actually did say you could say part of it, but and it costs essentially nothing, or it costs very little. We were using secure email with PGP encryption. We had a very secure minimal wiki. Just a bunch of sort of open source tools that somebody took the time to really secure really well. And then it was a trust-based relationship where, you know, a couple of people got together, it started working for them, and they started bringing more and more people in. The odd thing is that the hacking community already has this. So I'm a member of one of the hacking groups, and I'm one of the few people in there that uses my full name, so you can go find me. But I'm a trusted member of that organization now. And it's got the classic hacking community thing where you sort of work your way in through the levels. There's a wealth of information in there. And that particular group is not our adversary. Please, if anybody's watching it, don't think that I'm saying as much. They have been a tremendous source of information for me to better understand the hobby community, the hacking community, what is and is not possible. And I hope I've been able to give back to their community as well. But they are a model of, hey, here's how people can share information and do so in a secure fashion. So both the AV ISAC and the other model are worth doing. I think it's much faster to go stand up the sort of trusted relationship between peers model, and the AV-ISAC is likely, unless some one or two large companies, AirMap, Precision Hawk, somebody like that says, yeah, we understand the value of it, we'll be founding charter members of it.
Mm. Yeah, wow. And, I guess in terms of what you were mentioning about some of those hacking groups, you really did fill that in one of your threat matrix there, where, for example, you had, the drone hobbyists with the compliance and all the way down, but the uninhibited is quite interesting because that's almost like your drivers who, go a little faster, do some burnouts, do some donuts, but they're really experienced drivers and they're doing it in controlled manners. And sure, sometimes that can reflect a bad name on the industry, but they are controlled, and sometimes they're in a safer position than those who maybe don't know the rules and are acting unskilled. So quite an interesting concept that you talk about there. And I think when it comes down to that, you want to look at what's the actual threat to infrastructure. As you said, is it the uninhibited, or is it actually the threat actors who want to do that with their motivations and their goals? So I think that's really quite important. So I do have some questions here for you, David, if you still have time to answer them.
Yep, happy to.
Brilliant. So the first question came in from Ken and said, how on earth is there no result for the Eastern Colorado incident? Was the Army not involved? What would it take to trigger military intervention? And how was the FBI not involved in this?
To answer the last question first, I think every single possible federal agency that might have had some bearing on the problem got involved. Sheriff's Department, FBI, there are missile silos in that region as well. So Strategic Command got involved. Everybody was involved at some point. How was it not resolved? One hypothesis is that somebody was out there essentially red teaming something. I, through the community, could certainly go hire some of the appropriate people to go operate those sorts of UAVs in a covert fashion. There's plenty of spaces out there to hide in. And what that really illuminated for all of us is that the mechanisms are not in place for identifying this sort of activity. And as long as the operators are practicing good OPSEC and not talking about what they were doing, it's relatively easy to go do that. And similarly, and that's where Palo Verde comes in, how on earth did somebody fly for 2 nights running for 80 minutes at a time over the largest nuclear reactor in the United States and no one know what happened? It's the same sort of thing.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. That's quite interesting. And when it comes to one of these next questions, and it probably ties into that, is you speak a lot about the different and typical issues to infrastructure, but what are your actual recommendations for infrastructure hardening, and does Counter-UAS actually fall into that? There's a second part of the question, but I'll let you answer that first.
Counter-UAS is one of many things that you need to consider about how to protect your site. I used to do executive protection, so we were protecting homes. The first thing we did was threat intelligence. The first thing we did is figure out what sort of people might be coming at us and what sort of resources it might bring to bear on us, and how to start mitigating all the risks that they posed. For a site, Counter-UAS is certainly going to be part of the answer, and it may not be Counter-UAS with neutralization turned on. It may just be Counter-UAS with just pure detection turned on, so you understand whether there is or is not a problem. If you have a UAV over your site, there may be certain steps you would want to take. Other things will be, thinking about your OPSEC. Are your radio links encrypted? So if you've got somebody flying a drone over there to pick up your radio traffic, can they actually get anything? You're going to need to look at, if you're thinking about it from a drone perspective, can you push back your sight lines? So do you have like woods or anything encroaching on your fences? If you can push that back a quarter mile or half a mile, you now extend the amount of time that a UAV needs to fly to get over your site. That gives you more response time. It makes it more difficult for the operator. And all those sorts of things that make it more difficult for the potential threat actor to have their desired effect upon you are things you can do, or many of the things you can do without actually deploying a Counter-UAS system. That said, Counter-UAS systems do bring value. Simply knowing that something is overhead is very helpful, and eventually you will get that neutralization capability.
Okay. And then there was another question that came in actually via email, which is the only email question tonight, and it said, so what is URSA specifically as a company doing about this, and how are you involved?
I specifically left out all the marketing from this presentation. Thank you for asking. Thank you for the opportunity. URSA is Unmanned and Robotic Systems Analysis. We fundamentally focus on extracting telemetry data from a variety of unmanned systems, applying advanced analytics to that, machine learning, statistical analysis, AI if appropriate, and developing visualization tools to help a variety of different types of people understand what is going on with unmanned systems. It could be regulators wanting to know, hey, how close are UAVs getting to manned aircraft? There's a lot of reports of that, but we don't have any hard evidence to say, here's how close they really were getting. We're working with the FAA to help understand that. We're working with Counter-UAS industry by helping do some of these tests. We're the system of record for some of these test and evaluation exercises, so that there is a single source of truth. All the information about how the aircraft and the Counter-UAS systems were behaving are in one spot. And so now you can say, the UAV was here, the Counter-UAS system thinks it was here, why is there a discrepancy? And finally, we're helping operators understand how their systems are behaving, and starting to do some predictive analytics for operators so that they can help reduce the potential of in-flight failures. So it comes down to, we're not doing imagery analysis, we're doing telemetry analysis, and we're really doing it to help people understand the who, what, when, why, where, how of unmanned systems.
Brilliant. Well, hopefully that answers your question. And David, I'll forward you the person's contact as well who asked that.
Thank you.
So, David, I want to thank you again for your time and dedication, as well to extend that to Tim Wright. So thank you, Tim and David, for both for your contribution. And I'm sure there's others in the URSA team that all contributed. So thank you for that. So I'm just going to switch to my screen now. And David, I want to thank you and say that, we're really appreciative of that. And I'm going to say some final words now.